is Damon Fordham, Professor of History at Springfield College in Charleston, South Carolina, and the author of several books. I'm here to talk to you this morning about the idea of being lost without a leader. Back in 1991, when you had what was called Malcolm Mania, a lot of people were wearing Malcolm X on their t-shirts and hats and so forth, and in 1992 Spike Lee would make the movie about Malcolm X, which made him a popular icon at that time. Well, during that time period, his daughter, a real young lady by the name of Malika Shabazz, came to the College of Charleston, which I was studying at graduate school at the time. And I got to meet her, and she managed to autograph one of her father's books for me. This is a clipping of the event and how she looked at the time. And this is the autograph which she made for me, which says, it's hard to read, I know, on this, but it says as follows: to Damon Fordham, love, peace, and unity, Malika Shabazz, 1991. The significant thing about that is the conversation that I had with her afterwards. I asked her how did she feel about the adulation that her father was receiving in those days, many years after his death. And she said that on one level, she was pleased. But on the other hand, she had a problem with the fact that so many people were running around saying, "We need another Malcolm X," or "We need another Martin Luther King," and so forth. And she didn't see that as being productive. She told me that people should read her father's teachings and read Martin Luther King's teachings and the rest of them so that they could become their own Martin Luther King and their own Malcolm X. And that makes a lot of sense. You see, among the great leaders of history, they followed in a pattern of a chain of wisdom that goes as follows, that I think would do a lot of people a lot of good today. You see, back in the 1800s, you had the great freedom fighter Frederick Douglass. Douglass wrote about his experiences in the Life and Times of Frederick Douglass, which is one of my favorites. And Douglass, as many of you may know, was born in slavery in Maryland. When he was a young man, he overheard his master saying that if he learned how to read, he would never be fit to be a slave. So he managed to get a book called The Columbian Orator, and he learned to read. And not only did he learn to read, he also went on to forge his own path so he could go on a train to New York, become a free man. He went throughout the United States and England, as much of the English-speaking world, speaking out against slavery, to where in 1863 he negotiated with Abraham Lincoln himself, and of course the rest is history. So he preserved his teachings, of course, in the Life and Times of Frederick Douglass, which we can learn from and be inspired by today. But he also did something else very significant. You see, in the mid-1890s, shortly before Douglass died, there was another young man who was going places. You see, Booker T. Washington, who was also born a slave in West Virginia, walked 400 miles from Malden, West Virginia to Hampton, Virginia, so he could get an education at the Hampton Institute. So he went on to form the Tuskegee Institute in Alabama, which became a major African-American institution, as well as a place that educated many black Southerners, as well as American Indians and students of color from other countries. One of the great things that he did was to inspire many of his students to start schools like that of his own throughout the United States. One such student was William J. Edwards, who founded the Snow Hill Academy in Alabama. William J. Edwards was the great-grandfather of the movie producer Spike Lee, who made the Malcolm X movie. Interesting irony, isn't it? Well, before Booker T. Washington died, he befriended another young man, this one from the West Indies. And the young man from the West Indies corresponded with him about the possibility of starting a school and establishing leadership in the West Indies, just as Booker T. Washington did in the United States. Because, see, the young man happened to read Booker T. Washington's book, Up from Slavery, that I have here, and he was very inspired by that. So Booker T. Washington exchanged 7 friendly letters with this young man, giving him advice on leadership and how to run a school and so forth. And he invited the young man to come to America and learn from him. Well, by the time the young man got here, Booker T. Washington was dead. But the young man went on to do very well for himself. His name was Marcus Mosiah Garvey. Marcus Garvey went on to form the Universal Negro Improvement Association, which was the largest organization of people of African descent at that time, up to that time. And he went on to basically preach African nationalism and self-reliance. So much so that by 1957, 17 years after his death, Kwame Nkrumah managed to use Garvey's teachings to liberate his nation of Ghana from the British. Well, another thing about Garvey is that he was incarcerated in the 1920s on what many believe is a trumped-up charge of mail fraud. And while he was incarcerated, he had a young man who was following him who wrote a petition to the President of the United States, Calvin Coolidge, to help to see to it that he would be released. Well, President Coolidge did release Garvey, but he also deported him and sent him back to Jamaica. The young man who did that petition was a man by the name of Reverend Earl Little, who was the father of Malcolm Little, who we know today, of course, as Malcolm X. So you see that chain of wisdom goes full circle. Now, the point of all of this is that many people today are walking around, oh, we have no leadership, we're lost, we're confused, help me, somebody, all this, this type of attitude. Here's the truth of the matter. I want you to think about this, folks. When the Christians want to know what Jesus said, the Christians know that Jesus is no longer physically among us on the planet Earth, walking as a man as he once did in the days of the Roman Empire. But when the Christians want to know what Jesus said, along with prayer, they read the New Testament, which collected the teachings of Jesus, and so they apply these teachings within themselves and to adapt it to their modern situation to help them move forward, right? Well, the Muslims do the same thing with the Prophet Muhammad. The Muslims know that the Prophet Muhammad is no longer with us, so they read the Quran so they can learn what the Prophet Muhammad taught, so they could apply it to their daily lives so they could do better and move forward. This is true in most religions. Among the Baha'i faith, they do the same thing with the teachings of Abdul-Baha and his father Baha'u'llah. And the Buddhists do this with their teachings, as well as the Hindus and the Jews with what's often referred to as the Old Testament or the Torah, and so forth. This is how most people get ahead. They don't sit around waiting for leaders. They find out what the great teachers of what they believe taught, and they read it, study it, and apply it to move forward. The same is true with the great men of whom I speak. People don't necessarily have to go around, where is the next Martin Luther King, or where is the next Malcolm X, and so forth. If you love what Martin Luther King taught, very simple. Read one of Martin Luther King's books, such as Why We Can't Wait, or get one of the numerous DVDs about his life, and other books such as Where Do We Go From Here, and there are many sermons of his available on CD that you could listen to, and several great documentaries on DVD that you could watch. If you happen to be very fond of Medgar Evers, for example, well, there's the autobiography of Medgar Evers. You could learn that and read how he stood up to the power structure in Mississippi and the advances that he made down there before his assassination. And Martin Luther King himself, incidentally, one of the reasons why Martin Luther King became a great man was because he also studied the teachings of Mohandas Gandhi, who used nonviolence to free the Indians from the British, which led to the independence of the nation of India. So, therefore, there's no need for anyone today to be lost without a leader. Study the teachings of the greats, apply them to your daily life, and you teach that to others, and you organize beyond that, so you will no longer be lost without a leader and part of that great chain of wisdom. This is Damon Fordham, Professor of History at Springfield College in Charleston, South Carolina.